My name is Clara Bishop, and at 34 years old, I had made a fragile peace with the idea that my life's biggest dream was dead. I was a nurse, a very good one, but I was supposed to have been a doctor. I never imagined that a terrifying, mysterious illness that brought one of London's greatest hospitals to its knees would become the only path back to the life I was forced to leave behind, and in the process prove everything I knew to be true. It was a victory I never sought, but one that changed my entire world. Before I dive into this story of how a whispered complaint from a dying patient and a trick of the light on a plastic bag exposed a fatal flaw in modern medicine, I'd love to know where you all are watching from today. Let me know in the comments below. And if you've ever felt like your voice was being ignored or your knowledge was being dismissed, go ahead and hit that like button so I know I'm not alone. For all the new viewers here, make sure you subscribe because this is a community for people who understand that sometimes the quietest voices have the most important things to say. St. Jude's Teaching Hospital was a world unto itself, a sprawling Victorian giant in the heart of London that smelled perpetually of antiseptic, floor polish, and faintly of human hope and despair. Its halls were a rigid caste system. At the top were the consultants, gods in well-tailored suits. Below them were the registrars and junior doctors, their loyal acolytes. And then there was us, the nurses. We were the machinery of the place, the ones who kept the heart of the hospital beating. We were the hands, the eyes, the ears. We saw everything, but we were not expected to have a mind, especially not a mind that dared to challenge the gods. And in this pantheon, Julian Davenport was Zeus in training. He was the star medical student, blessed with the kind of effortless brilliance that made consultants swoon, and a jawline that made junior nurses blush. He moved through the wards not as a student, but as a king inspecting his domain. He had memorized every textbook, could recite differential diagnoses in his sleep, and possessed an unshakable, armor-plated belief in his own infallibility. To him, patients were not people, they were fascinating puzzles to be solved, and nurses, well, we were simply the furniture in the room where the puzzle was located. He barely saw us, and when he did, his gaze was laced with a dismissive contempt that was as sharp and cold as a scalpel. He particularly disliked me. I think it was because he sensed that I didn't just see the puzzle, I saw the person, and sometimes I saw the solution long before his brilliant, textbook-addled mind could get there. I had a decade of hands-on experience etched into my bones, a library of smells, sounds, and feelings that no book could ever teach. This, to Julian Davenport, was not knowledge. It was a folksy, sentimental craft, and he made sure I knew it. Our silent war began in earnest over Mrs. Gable. She was a sweet, anxious woman in her 70s, recovering from a hip replacement. She was doing well by the books, her charts were perfect, but as I did my afternoon rounds, I saw things that weren't on the chart. A faint, almost imperceptible blue tinge to her nail beds, the way she took a sharp little breath when she thought no one was looking. I asked her how she was feeling. "A bit on edge, dear," she'd said, patting my hand. "Just a bit fluttery." Julian was leading the student rounds that day, preening under the watchful eye of the registrar. He presented Mrs. Gable's case with his usual theatrical flair. "Textbook recovery," he declared. "A little post-operative anxiety, which is to be expected." He smiled condescendingly at the elderly woman. "Nothing to worry your head about." I waited until they had moved on before I approached the registrar, a harried but decent man named Dr. Kahn. I kept my voice low. "Doctor, could you take another look at Mrs. Gable? I'm concerned about a possible PE, a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot in the lung." It was a hunch, a whisper of wrongness pieced together from a dozen tiny, unquantifiable observations. Dr. Kahn frowned, annoyed at the interruption. But he knew me. He knew I didn't fuss over nothing. "What are you seeing, Nurse Bishop?" "Subtle cyanosis, a new complaint of anxiety, and her calf is tender on the left side. It's slightly warmer than the right." Julian had overheard. He turned, a smirk playing on his lips. "Anxiety and a warm leg. Nurse Bishop is practicing voodoo diagnostics again. It's on her chart, Con. She has a history of anxiety. It's a classic presentation." But Dr. Kahn was already walking back to the bed. He examined Mrs. Gable's leg, his frown deepening. He listened to her chest. He ordered an emergency CT scan. An hour later, Mrs. Gable was in the intensive care unit, being treated for multiple, life-threatening pulmonary emboli. My hunch had saved her life. I felt no triumph, only a quiet, weary relief. But Julian was incandescent. He cornered me later in the corridor, his body blocking my path, his voice a low, furious hiss that no one else could hear. "You went over my head. You made me look like an idiot." I was concerned about my patient, I said, my voice colder than I intended. "Your patient," he scoffed, his eyes blazing. "She is a case study, a collection of symptoms. She is my responsibility to diagnose, not yours. You are here to follow orders, to change bedpans and fluff pillows. Do not ever forget that again." He leaned in closer, his expensive cologne making me want to gag. "This isn't over, Bishop. You'll learn your place." He walked away, leaving me trembling, not with fear, but with a righteous anger that had been simmering just beneath the surface for 10 long years. He had no idea what my place was supposed to have been. He had no idea what it had cost me to be standing in this corridor, in this uniform, being spoken to like a child. 10 years ago, I hadn't been Nurse Bishop. I had been Clara Bishop, medical student. I had the acceptance letter from King's College London framed on my bedroom wall. It was the culmination of my entire life, the singular focus of my existence since I was a little girl who bandaged her dolls and read her father's old anatomy textbooks. My parents had been so proud. My father, a builder, had held the letter in his calloused hands like it was a holy relic. "My daughter," he'd say to anyone who would listen, "she's going to be a doctor." The dream lasted for 3 glorious months. I bought the books. I attended the introductory lectures. I felt the thrill of my future clicking into place. And then, the phone call. It was my mother, her voice thin and shattered. My father's small construction business, the one he had built from nothing, had collapsed in the financial crisis. They had leveraged everything, including the house. They were bankrupt. They were losing it all. I went home that weekend to a house that was no longer ours, to a father who had shrunk into himself, a ghost haunted by shame. He couldn't look me in the eye. "I'm so sorry, Clara," he'd whispered, his big, strong hands shaking. "I've ruined it. I've ruined your future." There was no choice to be made. There was only reality. Medical school was an impossible luxury. They needed me. I withdrew my application, cashed in the bonds my grandmother had left me for my education, and gave the money to my parents to find a small flat to rent. I enrolled in an accelerated nursing program at a community college. It was faster, cheaper, and it meant I could work and send money home. It was the sensible, practical, responsible thing to do. It was also the sound of a door slamming shut on the only life I had ever wanted. I told myself it was fine, that I could still help people, that being a nurse was a noble profession, and it was. I loved my patients. I loved the tangible act of caring for someone, of easing their pain. But every time I saw a group of fresh-faced medical students trailing a consultant, every time I heard one of them make a brilliant diagnostic leap, a part of me would ache with a phantom limb kind of pain. The pain of the life I should have had. Julian Davenport, with his casual arrogance and his inherited certainty, was a walking, talking embodiment of that phantom life. He had what I had lost, and he didn't even appreciate it. He thought he had earned it, not knowing that for some people, the opportunity itself was the prize. My anger at him was tangled up in a decade of grief for the woman I was supposed to have become. His campaign to belittle me became more overt after the Mrs. Gable incident. He found ways to mock me that were just subtle enough to be deniable. He'd ask my opinion on a patient's comfort in a tone dripping with sarcasm, as if consulting a hotel concierge about the quality of the pillows. He called me Nurse Nightingale whenever I showed a patient extra kindness. The true humiliation, however, came during grand rounds with Dr. Alistair Graves. Dr. Graves was the head of general medicine, a terrifyingly intelligent man whose silences were more intimidating than other men's shouts. He missed nothing. We were gathered around the bed of a patient with a baffling set of electrolyte imbalances. Julian, as usual, was holding court, presenting a complex and elegant theory involving a rare kidney disorder. It was a beautiful theory, straight from the latest edition of Harrison's Principles of Internal Medicine. Dr. Graves listened impassively, then turned his piercing gray eyes on me. Nurse Bishop, what was the patient's total urine output over the last 24 hours? It was a test, but not for me. 2,450 milliliters, doctor. I answered immediately. I didn't need to check the chart. Those numbers were seared into my brain, and his fluid intake was 2,200. And his clinical presentation? Graves asked, his eyes still on me. He's complaining of muscle cramps, and his skin turgor is poor despite the positive fluid balance. When I changed his sheets this morning, they were damp with sweat. A flicker of interest in Graves's eyes. The sweating was a new piece of information, something that didn't quite fit. It suggested a different kind of fluid loss, one that wouldn't show up in the output charts. It pointed away from the kidneys and towards something else entirely. Julian's elegant theory began to crumble. He saw it, and the look he gave me was pure poison. Later that day, he made his move. He found me at the nurses' station, where several junior nurses and a porter were within earshot. He spoke in a deliberately loud, carrying voice. "I have to commend you, Bishop. Your attention to detail is truly astonishing. The dampness of the sheets. It's a level of observation I truly envy." He paused for effect. It seems my years of studying cellular biology and pharmacology were a waste of time. All I really needed was an overdeveloped maternal instinct and a deep-seated obsession with laundry. The junior nurses stifled giggles. The porter suddenly found the floor fascinating. My face burned, a hot, creeping flush of shame that started at my collarbones and rose to the roots of my hair. I said nothing. I just stared at the computer screen, my hands frozen on the keyboard. He wanted a reaction. He wanted me to cry or shout, to prove I was the hysterical, overly emotional nurse he painted me as. I would not give him the satisfaction. I remained perfectly still until he swaggered away, leaving his smug laughter hanging in the air behind him. I finished my shift, my movements stiff and robotic. I walked home in a daze, and that night, for the first time in years, I took the old framed acceptance letter out of its box, and I allowed myself to weep. The first sign that something was truly wrong at St. Jude's came in the form of Mr. Hemlock. He was a 50-year-old accountant, a perfectly healthy man who'd had a routine appendectomy and was due for discharge. On his third post-operative day, his temperature spiked to 40 degrees Celsius. He became delirious, trying to climb out of bed, speaking to people who weren't there. A blotchy purple rash bloomed across his chest. Julian, of course, was first on the scene. This was exactly the kind of dramatic, acute case he loved. It was a chance to be the hero. He radiated a focused, confident energy. "It's a fulminant sepsis," he announced to the gathered team. "Almost certainly a multi-drug-resistant staphylococcus from the surgery, a hospital-acquired infection." It made sense. It was the logical, textbook conclusion. He ordered a battery of tests and started Mr. Hemlock on a powerful, broad-spectrum antibiotic cocktail delivered intravenously. I was the one tasked with hanging the IV bag. As I prepped Mr. Hemlock's arm, I leaned in close to try and calm him. It was then that I smelled it. Beneath the sterile, chemical hospital smell, there was something else on his breath. It was a faint, cloying odor, almost sweet, but with a strange, metallic undertone, like old pennies. I had smelled thousands of patients in my career. I had smelled the pear drop scent of ketoacidosis, the musty odor of liver failure, the ammonia tang of kidney disease. This was different. This was a smell I had never encountered before. "Dr. Davenport," I said, keeping my voice neutral, "have you noticed the smell on his breath? It's unusual." He didn't even look up from the chart. He was already writing his notes, documenting his heroic diagnosis. "I've noticed he has an infection, Nurse Bishop. That tends to happen with sepsis. Try to keep up." His dismissal was so casual, so absolute. I looked at the patient, thrashing in his bed. I looked at the IV bag, dripping its clear, supposedly life-saving fluid into his veins, and a cold knot of dread formed in my stomach. Julian was confident. He was brilliant, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was profoundly, terrifyingly wrong. The dread in my stomach bloomed into a quiet panic over the next 48 hours. Julian's antibiotic cocktail, the most powerful weapon in the hospital's arsenal, did nothing. Mr. Hemlock's fever remained stubbornly high, his delirium worsening. The rash on his chest darkened, the blotches coalescing into ugly, bruised-looking patches. His kidney function began to decline. He was dying, and nobody knew why. Then it happened again. A woman on the orthopedic ward, recovering from knee surgery, developed the same constellation of symptoms: a sudden, intractable fever, acute confusion, the same horrifying rash. Then, a patient on the cardiology floor, a man who had come in for observation after a minor arrhythmia. Fever, delirium, rash. It was spreading, but it made no sense. There was no link. They were on different wards, cared for by different teams, had undergone different procedures. The only common denominator was the hospital itself. A palpable tension descended on St. Jude's. It was in the hushed, urgent conversations in the corridors, the grim faces of the consultants during their emergency meetings. Infection control teams swept through the wards, taking swabs from every surface. The air itself began to feel contaminated. Julian was at the epicenter of the storm. The failure of his initial diagnosis and treatment had been a blow to his ego, and he reacted not with humility, but with a frenzied, defensive arrogance. He worked tirelessly, barely sleeping, his white coat becoming progressively more rumpled, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion and frustration. He could be seen in the hospital library at all hours, surrounded by stacks of obscure medical journals, hunting for an answer. He theorized about an airborne virus, a new, unidentifiable bacterial strain. He blamed the hospital's ventilation system, its laundry service, its food supply. He had a dozen theories, all of them brilliant, all of them plausible, and all of them leading nowhere. I watched him, and I watched the patients. While he was chasing exotic pathogens in textbooks, I was doing what I had always done. I was on the floor. I was changing damp sheets, recording vital signs, holding hands, and listening. I couldn't shake the memory of that strange metallic smell on Mr. Hemlock's breath. On a whim, I went to see the new patient on the orthopedic ward. I made an excuse about checking her IV line. As I leaned over her, I took a quiet, deep sniff. There it was, fainter than on Mr. Hemlock, but unmistakable. The same wrong smell. That night, I went home and I did something I knew was a violation of protocol. I took a blank notepad from my bag and I started my own chart. At the top, I wrote the names of the 3 affected patients: Hemlock, Davies, Singh. I listed their wards, their ages, their primary diagnoses. Then I started a new set of columns, columns that didn't exist on the official hospital charts. I wrote down everything I could remember, every tiny detail. I wrote, strange smell on breath, sweet metallic. The next day, a 4th patient fell ill. A young woman on my own ward admitted for gallbladder surgery. As her fever spiked, I was the one at her bedside. Before the delirium fully took hold, she looked at me, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. "Nurse," she whispered, her tongue thick. "My mouth, it tastes funny, like I've been sucking on a 2-pence coin." My blood ran cold. I wrote it down in my notepad as soon as I got the chance. Patient reports coppery/metallic taste in mouth prior to fever onset. I knew I was onto something. A specific, subjective sensory experience reported by a patient was exactly the kind of clue Julian would dismiss as irrelevant noise. To me, it felt like a key. I started to dig. I spent my lunch breaks and the quiet hours of the late-night shifts poring over digital patient records. I wasn't looking for a diagnosis. I was looking for a pattern, any pattern at all. I cross-referenced their medications, their dietary records, the anesthetics they'd received, the surgical dressings used. Nothing. The link was invisible. Frustrated, I started thinking about the basics. What did every single one of these patients receive, regardless of their condition or location in the hospital? The answer was simple: intravenous fluids. Saline drips to keep them hydrated, to deliver medication. It was ubiquitous, as common as the bed sheets and the air they breathed. I pulled up the dispensing records from the pharmacy. Each IV bag was stamped with a batch number. I painstakingly traced every bag administered to all 4 patients in the 48 hours before they got sick. My heart hammered in my chest as the results came up on the screen. Hemlock, Davies, Singh, Peterson. They had all received saline bags from one of two batches, 7B4 and 7B5. Patients on the same wards who remained healthy had received fluids from other batches. This was it. This had to be it. My mind was racing. What could be in the saline? A bacterial contamination should have been caught by the lab. It had to be something else. A chemical contaminant. A heavy metal? It would explain the metallic taste, the neurological symptoms, the kidney failure. It would explain why the antibiotics weren't working. We weren't fighting an infection. We were dealing with a poisoning, and we were administering the poison ourselves, dripping it directly into our patients' veins. I knew I had to tell someone, but who? If I went to a registrar, they'd ask for proof, for data I wasn't supposed to have. If I went to Julian, he would laugh in my face and then have me fired for accessing patient records without authorization. I felt trapped. I was holding a terrifying, life or death secret, and I had no legitimate way to share it. The decision was made for me. Late one night, the ward was quiet. I was in the small, cramped break room, my secret notepad and printouts of the pharmacy records spread across the table. I was trying to build a timeline, to make my case so undeniable that no one could dismiss it. I was so engrossed I didn't hear the footsteps approaching. The door swung open and Julian was standing there. He had been on call for 36 hours straight, and he looked it. His eyes were red-rimmed, his hair was a mess, and his face was pale with stress. He saw the papers on the table, and his exhaustion was instantly replaced by a cold, hard fury. "What is this?" he demanded, striding into the room. He snatched one of the pharmacy records from the table before I could stop him. His eyes scanned the page, then flicked to my handwritten notes. Batch numbers? Metallic taste? He let out a short, incredulous laugh, but there was no humor in it. "My God, you're actually playing detective." "Julian, listen to me," I pleaded, standing up. "It's the saline. All the patients who got sick received fluids from batches 7B4 and 7B5. It has to be contaminated." He stared at me as if I had just started speaking in tongues. "Contaminated? With what? Little green men? Pixie dust?" "The saline is manufactured by one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world. It goes through dozens of sterility checks. What you are suggesting is not only insane, it's libellous." "But the pattern—" "There is no pattern," he shouted, slamming the paper down on the table. "There is only a nurse with a hero complex who is massively overstepping her position. You have been accessing patient records you have no right to, conducting your own little unauthorized, unscientific investigation. This is a gross violation of every rule in this hospital. This is a firing offense, Bishop. I could have your nursing license revoked for this." "I'm trying to save our patients," I cried, my voice shaking with a mixture of fear and frustration. "Your treatments are not working because you're treating the wrong thing." "My treatments are based on science," he spat, his face inches from mine. "Your theories are based on gossip and a patient's funny taste in their mouth. You are a danger, and I am going to put a stop to it." He turned on his heel and stormed out of the room. I knew exactly where he was going. He was going to find Matron Finch, the head nurse of the entire hospital. My career at St. Jude's was over. Matron Finch was a woman who seemed to be carved from ancient, unyielding oak. She had been at St. Jude's for 40 years, and her expression was permanently fixed in a look of mild disapproval. She had seen generations of arrogant young doctors come and go, and she suffered no fools. When Julian dragged me into her office, his face flushed with righteous indignation, she simply looked up over her spectacles and said, "Well," he launched into a breathless, furious tirade, waving my notepad like a piece of damning evidence. He detailed my unauthorized investigation, my wild speculation, and my dangerous and insubordinate behavior. He concluded by demanding my immediate suspension. "She is a menace to this hospital," he declared, his chest puffed out. Matron Finch listened to the entire performance without a word. When he was finally finished, she took a long, slow sip of her tea. Then she turned her cool, discerning gaze on me. "Nurse Bishop, is what Mr. Davenport says true? Have you been conducting your own inquiries into this outbreak?" I swallowed hard. My hands were clammy. Yes, matron, I have. And what, precisely, have you found? My heart was pounding, but I met her gaze. I laid it all out, just as I had for Julian. I spoke about the metallic taste, the strange smell on Mr. Hemlock's breath, the shared batch numbers of the IV fluids. I spoke not with the hysteria Julian had accused me of, but with the quiet, methodical certainty of a professional who trusted her own observations. When I finished, the silence in the small office was deafening. Julian was vibrating with impatience, ready for the matron to lower the boom. Instead, she set her teacup down with a delicate clink. She looked at Julian. Mr. Davenport, your passion is noted. Your concern for protocol is, as ever, exemplary. You may return to the ward. I will handle this. He looked stunned, as if he couldn't believe he was being dismissed. But matron, that will be all, she said, in a tone that brokered no argument. He shot me a look of pure hatred before exiting the office. Once he was gone, Matron Finch looked at me for a long moment. I braced myself for the end. You broke the rules, Clara, she said, her voice soft but firm. What you did was reckless and could have terrible consequences for you. She paused, picking up my notepad. She studied my meticulous notes. It was also, she continued, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. Excellent work. I stared at her, speechless. The doctors, she said, with a sigh that seemed to contain decades of frustration, they read the books, they look at the charts, they see the disease. A good nurse, a truly great nurse, sees the whole patient. They see the tiny details that get left out of the official record. They trust what the patient tells them, what their own senses tell them. She pushed the notepad back across the desk towards me. I cannot officially sanction this. You understand that, but you have a duty of care to your patients, and that duty overrides everything else. She looked me straight in the eye. Don't stop looking. It wasn't an order. It wasn't permission. It was a validation. It was the shield I needed. I left her office feeling not exonerated, but empowered. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. I had to find proof, something tangible, something even a man like Julian Davenport couldn't deny. The answer came, as it so often does, not in a moment of brilliant deduction, but by pure chance. It was 3 in the morning, the dead hour when the hospital is at its quietest. I was restocking the shelves in the ward's small, windowless supply closet. I was tired, my mind numb from going over the same facts again and again. I grabbed a 1-liter bag of saline from a box marked with the batch number 7B4. As I turned, the bag passed directly under the harsh fluorescent light fixture on the ceiling. For a single, fleeting second, the light refracted through the clear plastic and the supposedly sterile fluid, and I saw it. It wasn't a color, it was a distortion, a faint, milky opalescent swirl in the liquid, like a drop of oil in water, that caught the light and then vanished as I moved the bag. My breath caught in my throat. I held the bag up to the light again, tilting it back and forth. There it was, an almost imperceptible shimmer, a ghost in the machine. It was so subtle you would never see it unless you were looking for it, unless the light hit it at the exact right angle. A doctor, rushing to grab a bag during a crisis, would never notice, but a nurse, stocking shelves in the dead of night, might. My hands were shaking. I grabbed another bag from the same box. I held it under the light, the same ghostly swirl. Then I ran to the shelf where the newer stock was kept. I pulled out a bag from a completely different batch, a batch I knew was safe. I held it up to the light. It was perfectly, absolutely, crystal clear. I had it. I finally had the proof. This was the contaminant. This was the source of the poison. It wasn't just a theory anymore. It was real. I could see it with my own eyes. I stood there in the silent supply closet, a plastic bag of saline in my hand, and I felt the entire weight of the hospital settle onto my shoulders. The next patient to receive one of these bags would get sicker, and I was the only one who knew why. The crash alarm shattered the morning calm with its shrill, insistent shriek. My heart leaped into my throat. I knew, even before I heard the location, which room it would be. The cardiac monitors at the nurse's station confirmed it. Room 6, Mrs. Gable's room. The sweet old woman I had saved once before. The irony was a bitter pill. She had survived the blood clot only to be poisoned by the cure. I ran. The ward devolved into the controlled chaos of a medical emergency. Doctors and nurses converged on the room. I pushed my way through to see a scene of managed panic. Mrs. Gable was pale as a sheet, her breathing rapid and shallow. The monitor above her bed was a symphony of disaster, her blood pressure in a freefall. And at the center of it all was Julian. He was in his element, barking orders, his voice sharp and clear above the din. Sepsis-induced cardiogenic shock. She's bottoming out. I need a central line kit now. And push a full bolus of vasopressors through her IV. My eyes shot to the IV pole beside her bed, to the clear plastic bag hanging there, dripping its contents into her arm. Even from across the room, I could read the batch number printed on the label, 7B4. Julian was about to push a concentrated dose of medication through an IV line that was already delivering a steady stream of poison. He wasn't saving her. He was about to execute her. Something inside me snapped. The years of deference, of being quiet, of knowing my place, it all burned away in a rush of pure, undiluted adrenaline. I moved without thinking. I launched myself across the small room, shoving a junior doctor out of my way. "Stop," I screamed, the word tearing from my throat. Julian had a syringe of vasopressors in his hand, ready to inject it into the IV port. I reached her bedside just as he was about to depress the plunger. I did the only thing I could think of. I slammed my hand down hard over the port, blocking it. The room fell silent. Everyone froze. The only sound was the frantic, high-pitched beeping of the monitor. Julian stared at me, his face a mask of disbelief that quickly morphed into incandescent rage. "Have you lost your mind, Bishop?" he hissed, his voice trembling with fury. "Get your hand off my line. That is an order." "No," I said. My own voice was surprisingly steady, clear and ringing in the sudden quiet. "You are killing her." "Security!" Julian bellowed, his face turning a blotchy red. "Get this hysterical woman out of my patient's room." But before anyone could move, a new voice cut through the tension, calm and authoritative. "What is going on here?" Dr. Graves had arrived, drawn by the crash call. He stood in the doorway, his piercing gaze taking in the scene, the dying patient, the furious medical student, and the nurse with her hand clamped stubbornly over the IV port. He looked at me. "Nurse Bishop, explain yourself, and this had better be good." All eyes were on me. This was it, the end of my career, one way or another. I took a deep breath. I did not look at Julian. I looked directly at Dr. Graves, and I let the truth come out in a calm, measured flood. "It's not sepsis, doctor," I began, my voice ringing with a certainty I didn't know I possessed. "It's a poisoning. It's coming from the intravenous saline." I nodded towards the bag hanging from the pole. "That bag is from batch 7B4. Every single patient who has fallen ill in this hospital over the last week received fluids from either that batch or batch 7B." I could see the flicker of skepticism in Graves's eyes, but he didn't interrupt me. I pressed on. "The patients, before the fever starts, they report a metallic or coppery taste in their mouths. Mr. Hemlock had a distinct metallic smell on his breath. Their symptoms aren't consistent with infection. They're consistent with heavy metal toxicity. That's why the antibiotics have had no effect." Julian let out a sound of pure contempt. "This is insane. She's concocted some paranoid fantasy based on what she thinks she smelled." "It's not a fantasy," I said, my voice rising, my eyes still locked on Graves. I held up my other hand, which was clutching the saline bag I'd taken from the supply closet. "There's a contaminant in the fluid. You can see it, if the light is right." I tilted the bag, trying to catch the overhead fluorescent light. "It's an opalescent shimmer. It's in every bag from those 2 batches." The standoff was absolute. The monitor continued its frantic, desperate beeping, a clock ticking down on Mrs. Gable's life. Dr. Graves looked from my face, alight with desperate conviction, to Julian's, twisted with scorn and fury. He looked at the IV bag in my hand. He looked at the dying woman in the bed. He was a man of science, of evidence. Julian was offering him the textbook diagnosis. I was offering him a wild, unsubstantiated theory based on a nurse's observations. He made his decision. His voice cut through the air like a command. "Get that bag down," he said, pointing to Mrs. Gable's IV pole. "Now, get me a bag of saline from a different manufacturer and run it through a fresh line, and page the toxicology department. I want a rush screen on this patient's blood for heavy metals and industrial solvents, and someone get me a sample of the fluid from that bag." He looked directly at Julian. "You will do nothing until I say so." A collective gasp went through the room. A junior doctor scrambled to follow his orders, taking down the contaminated IV. Julian stood frozen, his face ashen, the syringe still clutched in his hand. He looked as though Graves had physically struck him. "And Nurse Bishop," Graves said, his voice softer now, "what would you do next?" "A chelating agent, doctor," I said without hesitation. "Something to bind with the contaminant and allow her body to excrete it." Graves nodded slowly. "Get it." The next 10 minutes were the longest of my life. The new clean IV was started. The antidote was administered. We all stood around the bed, watching the monitor, watching Mrs. Gable. For a few agonizing minutes, nothing changed. The blood pressure reading remained terrifyingly low. The heart rate alarm continued to scream. I could feel Julian's stare burning into the side of my head, willing me to be wrong. My own heart felt like it was going to beat its way out of my chest. Please, I thought, please let me be right. And then, a change. A single digit on the blood pressure monitor ticked upwards, then another. The frantic rhythm of the heart rate began to slow, the beeps coming further apart. The ragged, shallow breaths became deeper, more regular. A faint touch of pink returned to Mrs. Gable's gray cheeks. She was stabilizing. She was coming back. I was right. The room was silent, save for the now steady, rhythmic beep of the monitor. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I finally allowed myself to look at Julian. His face was a canvas of utter, catastrophic shock. The arrogance, the certainty, the contempt, it had all been wiped away, replaced by the horrifying, public dawn of his own fallibility. He saw me looking, and in his eyes I saw it all, the humiliation, the disbelief, and the one thing I never thought I would see from him: respect. The aftermath was a controlled hurricane. The moment Dr. Graves confirmed Mrs. Gable's rapid improvement, he locked down the entire hospital. An emergency alert went out. Every single bag of saline from the 2 offending batches was immediately confiscated from every ward, every supply closet, every operating theater. The hospital's chief pharmacist, a man with sweat beading on his upper lip, ran a preliminary test on a sample from one of the bags. The results came back within the hour. The saline was heavily contaminated with a chemical cleaning agent, a byproduct from a faulty sterilization process at the manufacturing plant. It was a 1 in a million industrial accident, and we had been unknowingly pumping it into our most vulnerable patients for over a week. My name was on everyone's lips. I was debriefed by a panel of grim-faced hospital administrators. I sat in a large, mahogany-paneled boardroom, a place nurses were never usually invited, and calmly recounted my observations, my secret charts, my discovery in the supply closet. I told them everything, expecting at any moment to be reprimanded for my breaches of protocol. Instead, they just listened, their expressions shifting from skepticism to awe. When I was done, the hospital's chief executive, a man I'd only ever seen in newsletters, stood up and shook my hand. "Nurse Bishop," he said, his voice heavy with emotion, "there is no exaggerating what you have done. You have saved this hospital from a catastrophe, and you have saved dozens of lives. We are all in your debt." It felt deeply, profoundly strange. I wasn't a hero. I was just a nurse who had been paying attention. The true reckoning came 2 days later. I was summoned to Dr. Graves's office. When I entered, my stomach clenched. Julian was already there, standing by the window, staring out at the London rain. He looked smaller, diminished, his usual confidence completely gone. He didn't look at me as I came in. Dr. Graves was sitting behind his large oak desk. He gestured for me to take a seat. "Clara," he said, using my first name for the first time ever. "The board has completed its preliminary inquiry. The manufacturer has admitted fault. The media will have a field day, but thanks to you, the story is one of a crisis averted, not a tragedy. He paused, leaning forward. Your clinical acumen, your bravery in the face of immense pressure and opposition, it was extraordinary. It was the work of a first-class diagnostician, the work of a fine doctor. The words hung in the air between us, the work of a doctor. It was the highest praise he could give, and it felt like a key turning in a lock deep inside me. He then turned his gaze to the figure by the window, Mr. Davenport. Julian flinched, then turned slowly to face us. His face was pale. You have a brilliant mind, Mr. Davenport, Graves said, his voice flat and cold. You have memorized every book, but you have no wisdom. You listen to your own pride instead of listening to your patient and to your team. You saw a nurse, and you were blind to the intellect standing right in front of you. Your arrogance nearly cost people their lives. You are suspended from all clinical duties effective immediately. Your performance will be reviewed by the Board of Medical Education. Frankly, I am not optimistic about the outcome. Julian just nodded, his eyes fixed on the floor. That's all I have to say to you, Graves finished. Then he stood up. I have a meeting. I will leave you two to talk. He walked out of the office, closing the door softly behind him, leaving me alone with my humbled adversary. The silence that descended was thick and suffocating. I didn't know what to say. I had won. The victory was total and absolute, but I felt no gloating, no desire for revenge. I just felt a great, hollow weariness. Finally, Julian spoke, his voice so quiet it was almost a whisper. You were right. He still couldn't meet my eyes. He was looking at his own hands, which were trembling slightly. You were right about everything. From the very beginning, Mrs. Gable, the embolism, all of it. He took a shaky breath. I kept looking in the books. I had all the world's knowledge at my fingertips, and it was useless. It was worse than useless. It blinded me. I thought I was fighting a disease, and I was the one poisoning them. He finally looked up, and his eyes were filled with a profound, soul-deep shame. What you did, it wasn't just good nursing, it was brilliant. It was a piece of diagnostic reasoning I couldn't have managed in a million years. He swallowed hard. I'm sorry, Clara, for everything, for the way I spoke to you, for the way I treated you, for not listening. It was not a grudging apology forced by a superior. It was a complete and total surrender. It was the confession of a man whose entire worldview had been shattered. He had built his identity on the foundation of being the smartest man in the room, and he had been forced to confront the fact that he wasn't. The quiet nurse he had dismissed as furniture was his superior. I simply nodded. There was nothing else to say. His punishment wasn't anything the hospital could mete out. It was the burden of this knowledge which he would have to carry for the rest of his life. A year can change everything. The Bishop incident, as it became known in the hushed corridors of St. Jude's, sent shockwaves through the institution. It forced a painful and necessary conversation about hospital hierarchy, about whose voices were valued and whose were ignored. One of the most tangible outcomes was the creation of the St. Jude's Clinical Excellence Scholarship, a new, fully funded program designed to fast-track experienced nurses and other clinical staff through medical school. I was, unanimously, its first recipient. And so, 1 year after that terrible week, I found myself walking through the familiar halls of St. Jude's, not in the crisp blue uniform of a nurse, but in the casual clothes of a medical student. I was back where I should have been all along. It felt different this time. I wasn't the bright-eyed, naive girl I had been at 24. I was a 35-year-old woman with a decade of grit and experience behind me. The academic work was challenging, but the clinical side felt like coming home. I understood the rhythms of the ward, the language of the patients, the subtle signs of distress, in a way my younger, brighter classmates couldn't yet comprehend. I was at the top of my class, not because I was the smartest, but because I knew how to listen. One afternoon, during my clinical rotation on the surgical ward, a junior resident approached me, a frown of concentration on his face. He was holding a patient's chart, looking utterly stumped. "Excuse me," he said, looking up. "I have a difficult case here, post-op fever of unknown origin. I've run all the standard tests. I was wondering if I could get your opinion." I looked up, and my breath caught. It was Julian. He looked different. The swagger was gone, replaced by a quiet humility. His career had survived, but only just. He'd been held back a year, forced to repeat his residency under strict supervision. The incident had marked him, humbled him. He met my eyes, and there was no trace of the old animosity, only the straightforward request of one colleague to another. "Bishop," he started, out of habit, then immediately corrected himself. "Clara, I could really use your opinion." I took the chart from his hand. "Of course, Julian," I said, my voice even. "Let's take a look together." As we walked towards the patient's room, the power dynamic between us felt settled, permanently and irrevocably reversed. He was no longer the star, and I was no longer in the shadows. We were just two people, trying to solve a puzzle, trying to help someone who was sick. Later, as I walked home, the setting sun glinting off the London skyline, I realized the victory hadn't been the moment Julian apologized in Dr. Graves's office. It hadn't even been the moment Mrs. Gable's monitor stabilized. The true victory was this. It was the quiet, unremarkable rightness of walking onto a ward and knowing I belonged there. It was the slow, steady healing of that old phantom wound. I hadn't needed Julian's validation, or Dr. Graves's praise, or even the scholarship. I had needed to prove to myself that the mind I had was worthy, that the dream I had been forced to abandon wasn't dead, just waiting for me to find my own, unconventional way back to it. I had finally learned my place. It was not as a doctor or as a nurse, but as myself, and that was more than enough. The most important lesson I took away from that whole experience is that your worth is not determined by the title on your name badge or the degree on your wall. It's determined by what you do, what you see, and the courage you have to speak up when you know something is wrong. Being underestimated by everyone around you can feel like a curse, but sometimes it can be your greatest strength. It forces you to work harder, to observe more closely, and to trust your own instincts above all else. I would love to hear from you all in the comments. Have you ever been in a situation where you were underestimated, where your knowledge was dismissed only to be proven right in the end? Share your stories below, because every one of them deserves to be heard. If this story resonated with you, please don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories about finding strength in unexpected places. Share this video with anyone you know who might need to be reminded of their own inner voice. Thank you so much for joining me and for listening to my journey. Remember that the world is full of people who will try to tell you what you are and what you are not. Don't listen to them. Listen to that quiet, steady voice inside you. It knows the truth. I wish you all the strength to make your own voice heard.